The angle of the afternoon shadow falling across the boundary line was wrong. I stopped the orbital sander. The sudden absence of the motor's whine left the humid air heavy with the scent of cut cedar and blooming jasmine. I wiped a layer of fine sawdust from my forehead with the back of my forearm, my eyes narrowing at the white picket fence separating my leased workshop from the residential lot next door. The pickets were leaning precisely 3 degrees toward my property. That wasn't what held my attention. Aurora was standing on her side of the fence. The coastal breeze caught the tangled ends of her reddish-brown hair, whipping it across her shoulders. She wore a simple white camisole that offered zero protection against the chill of the incoming marine layer, paired with faded black pants. She wasn't looking at the leaning wood. She was looking squarely at me. I dropped my hands into the pockets of my dark, faintly patterned work shirt. The fabric was stiff with wood glue and sweat. I walked over to the property line, the gravel crunching under my steel-toed boots. When I reached the fence, I didn't reach across it. I stopped exactly 1 foot away. Her green-blue eyes were dead serious. The tension in her jaw could have snapped a chalk line. She gripped the top of a white picket, her knuckles turning pale. "I saw you bring a girl home last night," Aurora said. Her voice lacked its usual melodic cadence. It was flat, carrying an undercurrent of something I couldn't immediately identify. I held her gaze. The silence stretched between us, accompanied only by the distant rattle of a delivery truck on the main road. I let the accusation hang in the air, studying the slight tremor in her fingers. I didn't rush to fill the quiet. I smiled, just a fraction. "Are you jealous?" Aurora let out a sharp, humorless exhale. "Don't flatter yourself, Hart. I'm panicked." She pulled a folded sheet of heavy stock paper from her back pocket and thrust it over the fence. I took it. The paper was crisp, carrying the unmistakable watermark of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association. I scanned the document. My eyes caught the bold lettering halfway down the page. It wasn't a warning. It was a formal citation, signed by Mrs. Higgins, the HOA board president. The document cited a violation of Section 4B regarding unauthorized commercial traffic and structural blight, specifically naming the white picket fence and the noise from my side of the property. The penalty attached was a lien warning. "That girl you brought home," Aurora continued, wrapping her arms around her ribs, "was Mrs. Higgins' niece. She's a zoning inspector for the county. Higgins sent her to take photos of your workshop and my fence from your driveway." My jaw tightened. The girl she meant was a client's daughter who had dropped off a set of antique brass hinges for a custom cabinet build I was finishing. Higgins had weaponized a simple material drop-off to build a case. "The fence is technically on my deed," Aurora said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Higgins gave me 30 days to replace the entire 70-foot span to community standards, or she places a lien on my house. I just paid off my mother's medical debt, Jackson. I don't have $6,000 for a fence." I looked at the rotting wood base of the pickets. The posts were seated directly in the soil, completely lacking concrete footers. Moisture rot had eaten through the bases. Higgins wasn't just being petty. She had found a legitimate structural failure and was using it to bleed Aurora out and get my commercial lease revoked in the process. "I'll handle the fence," I said. Aurora shook her head, taking a step back. "You can't just build a 70-foot fence for free." "Your materials alone—" "I said I'll handle it," I interrupted, my tone dropping an octave. I didn't offer a reassuring smile. I didn't give a grand speech about neighborly duty. I folded the citation and put it in my pocket. "Go inside. You're shivering." She didn't move immediately. She searched my face for a long moment, looking for a catch. Finding none, her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. She turned and walked back toward her porch. I watched her until her screen door clicked shut. Only then did I pull my hands out of my pockets. Tuesday morning tasted like copper and old coffee. I was already in the trench by 6 a.m. The ground along the property line was a nightmare of clay and embedded river rock. I drove the digging bar into the earth, the heavy iron ringing against stone. I leveraged my weight against the steel, prying loose a chunk of granite. My shoulders burned. I needed 21 post holes, each dug exactly 36 inches deep to clear the frost line, even in this mild climate. Code required it. Higgins would check. "You're not using a power auger." I paused, resting my forearms on the top of the digging bar. Aurora was standing on her porch holding 2 ceramic mugs. She wore an oversized gray sweater that swallowed her frame. "Clay destroys auger blades," I said, my breath pluming slightly in the morning air. "Hand digging gives me cleaner walls for the concrete pour." She walked down the steps, navigating the uneven grass carefully. She extended a mug. I wiped my hands on my work pants before taking it. Black coffee, no sugar. She had noticed my order from the corner diner 2 weeks ago. "Higgins sent an email to the entire community listserv last night," Aurora said, sipping from her mug. She kept her eyes on the trench, avoiding my face. "She claimed my property is lowering the block's appraisal value." People replied. Some agreed. I took a drink of the coffee. The heat grounded me. I didn't offer empty platitudes. I set my mug on the flatbed of my truck and picked up the post hole diggers. I plunged the twin blades into the loosened soil, clamped the handles together, and pulled out a clean cylinder of dark earth. "Let them email," I said. "Paper doesn't hold up structures." Later that afternoon, the first true test arrived. The sun was directly overhead, baking the back of my neck. I was setting the first 4x4 pressure-treated pine post into the corner hole. A silver sedan rolled to a stop at the curb. Mrs. Higgins stepped out. She wore a tailored beige suit that looked entirely out of place next to a construction zone. She carried a clipboard. "Mr. Hart," she called out, her voice carrying the shrill authority of someone used to immediate compliance. "I see you're attempting a repair. I must inform you that any structural work requires an approved variance from the Architectural Committee." I didn't stop what I was doing. I hoisted the 80-pound bag of fast-setting concrete, sliced the paper belly with my utility knife, and poured the dry mix around the base of the post. Dust plumed up. Aurora stepped out of her front door, her posture instantly rigid. "Mrs. Higgins," I said, finally turning to face the older woman. I kept my voice low, projecting calm. Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the HOA bylaws clearly states that emergency repairs to prevent boundary collapse are exempt from the standard 30-day review period, provided the materials match the existing structure. Higgins stopped at the edge of the driveway, her pen hovering over her clipboard. "This isn't an emergency." I grabbed my 4-foot spirit level and pressed it against the old fence section still standing near the sidewalk. The bubble floated entirely outside the lines. I pushed the wood with 2 fingers. The entire 8-foot panel swayed dangerously, the rusted nails squealing in the rotted stringers. "A 30-degree lean toward a public sidewalk constitutes a pedestrian hazard," I stated, rattling off the county building code without looking at a reference. "If this falls on a child, the HOA bears joint liability for ignoring a known danger. I am neutralizing your liability." Higgins's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at the swaying fence, then at my perfectly plumb new post. "I want the structural permits filed by Friday," she snapped, pivoting sharply on her heel. "They were filed yesterday at 4 p.m., I called after her. "Check your inbox." She didn't look back. The silver sedan sped away. I turned back to the trench. Aurora was staring at me from the porch steps. Her mouth was slightly parted. The rigid fear that had gripped her spine was completely gone. "You memorized the bylaws," she said softly. "I memorize the rules of whatever game I'm forced to play." I replied, picking up the garden hose to add water to the dry concrete mix. I focused on the water pressure, refusing to acknowledge the sudden, heavy warmth expanding in my chest at the relief on her face. By the end of the second week, the framework was up. The skeletal structure of posts and horizontal stringers divided our yards, smelling of fresh pine and galvanized fasteners. The physical labor was a barrier, keeping me focused. The real danger was the proximity. Aurora had started bringing her laptop out to the porch to work while I built. She was illustrating a children's book, her stylus moving rapidly across her drawing tablet. I was measuring the spacing for the vertical pickets. I needed exactly 2 3/8 inches between each slat. I used a scrap block of wood as a spacer, driving 3-inch exterior screws through the face of the picket into the stringer with my impact driver. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the drill was our only conversation. A sudden gust of wind swept across the yard, carrying a heavy, unnatural chill. The sky bruised purple to the west. "Storm's moving fast," I said, pausing the drill. Aurora looked up, her eyes widening. "The forecast said it was staying offshore." Before she could close her laptop, the sky opened. It wasn't rain. It was a sudden, violent hail squall. Ice the size of marbles pounded the roof, the driveway, and the unfinished fence. Aurora scrambled, trying to shield her expensive drawing tablet with her body as the hail battered her shoulders. I dropped my drill. I cleared the porch steps in 2 strides. I didn't grab her. I grabbed the heavy canvas tarp I used to cover my lumber stack. I snapped it open, throwing it over both of us like a makeshift tent, creating an immediate physical barrier against the falling ice. Under the heavy canvas, the world vanished. The roar of the hail hitting the tarp was deafening, but inside our small, dark space, there was only the sound of our breathing. She was pressed against my chest. Her hands were clutching her tablet against her stomach. I kept my arms raised, holding the tarp taut above us, ensuring none of my weight rested on her. My hands gripped the rough canvas until my knuckles ached. "Are you okay?" I asked. My voice sounded rough in the enclosed space. "Yeah," she breathed out. She looked up. In the dim light filtering through the fabric, her eyes were huge. The scent of her shampoo, something like crushed lavender and rain, filled my senses. The chaos outside was absolute, but under the tarp, a sudden, heavy silence settled over me. The constant gnawing weariness that usually lived at the base of my skull evaporated. I didn't want to touch her. I didn't want to pull her closer. I just wanted to keep the ice off her. This small, dark room we occupied was safe. "Your equipment," she whispered, looking toward the yard. "It's waterproof," I lied. My impact driver was sitting in the mud. I didn't care. We stood there for 4 minutes until the hail turned to a light, freezing rain. I pushed the tarp back, letting the cold air rush in. I immediately took 3 steps back, putting safe distance between us. I didn't look at her face as I walked out into the mud to retrieve my tools. The following Thursday, the midpoint arrived with the subtlety of a house fire. I was at the lumberyard loading the last batch of pre-primed pickets into my truck bed. My phone vibrated against my thigh. It was Aurora. "Jackson," she said. Her voice was shaking violently. "There's a man here, from the county. Higgins brought him." "Don't let them on the property," I said, slamming the tailgate shut. "I'm 5 minutes away." I made it in 4. When I pulled up to the curb, Higgins was standing on the sidewalk with a man wearing a high-visibility vest holding a digital level and a clipboard. Aurora was standing on her porch, her arms crossed tight, effectively acting as a barricade to her yard. I cut the engine and walked toward the group. I didn't run. Rushing showed panic. "What's the issue, Mrs. Higgins?" I asked, stopping next to Aurora. I placed myself slightly in front of her, subtly breaking the line of sight between her and the inspector. "This is Mr. Davies from County Zoning," Higgins said, a triumphant gleam in her eye. "I requested an emergency structural audit. A neighbor reported that your post depths are non-compliant. If they are, The entire structure must be torn down immediately, at your expense. My pulse ticked steady. I looked at Davies. You have a post-hole probe? The inspector looked mildly uncomfortable. He held up a thin steel rod with depth markers. Yes, sir. I just need to verify the footer depth on a random sample. Go ahead, I said, gesturing to the fence line. Aurora grabbed the back of my shirt, her fingers curling into the fabric. I didn't move, but I reached back and tapped her knuckles twice, a grounding wire. The tremor in her hand stopped. Davies walked over to the third post in the line. He drove the steel probe down through the wet soil next to the concrete footer. He pushed until it hit the compacted earth beneath the concrete. He pulled it out and wiped the mud off the markings. He frowned. He walked to the corner post and repeated the action. Then a third post. He walked back to Higgins. 36 inches dead on, ma'am. Every single one. The concrete mix is high strength, properly sloped away from the wood to prevent rot. This is commercial grade work. Higgins's face mottled with red. That's impossible. He built it too fast. He built it correctly, Davies corrected, handing Higgins a copy of his sign-off sheet. Have a good day, folks. As the inspector walked away, Higgins glared at us. She had lost her technical leverage, but she wasn't done. The board hearing is next Wednesday. You still need a majority vote to approve the aesthetic variant since you used a different finial cut on the pickets than the original. She got in her car and drove off. I turned to Aurora. She let go of my shirt. You knew, she said, letting out a long, shaky breath. You knew she'd call them. I always assume people will play dirty, I said, picking up a rogue nail from the grass. That's why you build the foundation deeper than they expect. The night before the board hearing, the tension in the air was brittle enough to snap. I was in my workshop, the large bay doors open to the evening air. The fence was completely finished, a gleaming white line of absolute precision separating our properties. It was perfect. I was restoring a small wooden jewelry box. It wasn't a client piece. I had found it discarded in the alley weeks ago, the hinges rusted, the veneer peeling. I was using a micro chisel to clean the old glue out of a dovetail joint. The work required microscopic focus. Footsteps sounded on the gravel. Aurora stopped at the edge of the light spilling from my garage. You shouldn't be working this late, she said. I blew the dust out of the joint. Can't sleep. She stepped into the workshop. She looked at the racks of clamps, the perfectly aligned hand planes, the meticulous order of my space. Higgins sent another email, Aurora said quietly. She's claiming that if the board approves the fence, it sets a precedent for unregulated commercial expansion. She's trying to scare the older residents into voting no. I set the chisel down. The sharp edge of my inner wound, the bitter history of losing my father's property to corporate lawyers who buried us in paperwork, flared hot in my chest. People with clipboards always thought they owned the world. I have the property survey, I said, my voice harder than I intended. I have the receipts. We'll present the facts. Jackson, she said, stepping closer to my workbench. What if they vote no? They can legally force me to tear it down. All your work, all that money. I can't pay you back. I looked at her. The harsh overhead lighting caught the exhaustion under her eyes. She was carrying a weight that wasn't hers to carry alone. I picked up the small jewelry box. I ran my thumb over the restored lid, the walnut wood now smooth as glass. I didn't say anything to comfort her. I didn't promise the world. I set the box in front of her. Open it. She hesitated, then reached out. She lifted the lid. The brass hinges moved silently. Inside, lying on the velvet lining, was the official stamped release of liability from the city, alongside a copy of my contractor's insurance policy, legally transferring all risk of the boundary line solely to my LLC. If they vote no, I said, looking directly into her eyes, they sue me, not you. Your house is safe. She stared at the papers. The silence in the workshop was absolute. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. You took on all the liability, she whispered. Why? I shoved my hands into my pockets. My fingers curled into fists against the rough denim. I didn't talk about the pull I felt when she walked into a room. I didn't talk about how her drawing on the porch had become the anchor of my day. Because my name is on the work, I said simply. I protect what I build. Wednesday night. The community center smelled of stale floor wax and cheap coffee. The room was packed. 20 residents sat in folding chairs, murmuring quietly. Higgins sat at the head table, flanked by 2 other board members. Aurora and I sat in the front row. I wore a clean, dark button-down shirt. No sawdust, no mud. I had brought a thick manila folder. Aurora sat rigidly beside me, twisting a silver ring on her right hand. Item 4, Higgins announced, tapping a pen against her microphone. The boundary fence at 402 Elm. As we are all aware, this was built without prior aesthetic approval. A low murmur went through the crowd. We are voting tonight on a mandate for removal, Higgins continued. Mr. Hart, Miss Evans, do you have anything to say? I stood up. I didn't walk to the microphone. I simply turned slightly so I could address both the board and the residents. I opened the folder. I have here the certified land survey, I said, projecting my voice clearly to the back of the room. The old fence was located entirely on Miss Evans's property. However, it leaned 30 degrees into the public right-of-way. I pulled out a stack of 8x10 glossy photographs. I handed them to the person in the front row, gesturing for them to pass them back. Those are photos of the rot at the base of the old structure, I continued. As you can see, the nails were fully oxidized. The wood was powder. It was a structural collapse waiting for a strong wind. Higgins scowled. That does not excuse bypassing the architectural committee. I bypassed the committee, Aurora's voice rang out. I stopped. I looked down at her. Aurora stood up. She didn't look at me. She looked directly at the crowd. Her chin was high. I am the homeowner, Aurora said clearly, her voice steady. When the county issued the warning, I could not afford a contractor. Jackson stepped in. He used his own time, his own materials, and his own license to prevent my house from being liened by this board. She turned to Higgins. You claim he bypassed the rules. The rule book states we must maintain community standards. Jackson built a fence that will last 50 years. It is perfectly plumb. It is painted to the exact hex code required by the bylaws. She reached out and took my hand, right there in front of 20 people. Her fingers were warm, slotting perfectly between mine. The transfer of stability was instantaneous. The residual anger I felt toward Higgins vanished, replaced by a sudden, grounding silence. The chaotic noise of the room faded. She wasn't hiding behind me. She was standing beside me. I chose to authorize the work, Aurora said, her grip on my hand tightening slightly. And I choose to stand by it. If you vote to tear it down, you are voting to punish a neighbor for helping another neighbor. The room went dead silent. A man in the third row, Mr. Henderson, a retired judge, stood up. The hex code matches. Swiss coffee white, I answered. 2 coats of exterior semi-gloss. Henderson looked at Higgins. The fence stays, Martha. Call the vote. I'm voting yes to the variance. The vote took less than 2 minutes. It was unanimous. Even the 2 board members sitting next to Higgins raised their hands in favor. Higgins stared at her notes, her leverage entirely broken. We walked out into the cool night air. The parking lot was empty save for my truck and a few sedans. The streetlights cast long amber shadows across the asphalt. The heavy burden that had been pressing on the neighborhood for 6 weeks was gone. The air felt lighter. Aurora didn't let go of my hand. We stopped by the passenger door of my truck. She looked up at me. The defensive tension that had defined her posture since the day at the fence was completely gone. She looked exhausted, but she looked at peace. "You let me speak," she said softly. "It's your house," I replied, my voice low. "It was your fight. I just provided the materials." She smiled, a real, full smile that reached her eyes. "You provided a lot more than that, Jackson." She stepped into my space. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask a question. She simply arrived. She reached up, her free hand resting flat against my chest, right over my heartbeat. I dropped my keys back into my pocket. I brought my hand up, resting it gently against the side of her neck, my thumb tracing the line of her jaw. I kissed her. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't an explosion. It was the heavy, grounding drop of an anchor hitting the seafloor. It was the feeling of a deadbolt sliding into place, locking out the noise, the threats, and the chaos of the world. It was a promise sealed in absolute silence. When I pulled back, her eyes remained closed for a second longer, a soft exhale escaping her lips. "Come on," I said, opening the truck door for her. "Let's go home." You know, looking back now, I realize something fundamental about the walls we build. Winning the wrong way is actually losing. True victory is sleeping with a clear conscience. When you fight with facts, patience, and integrity, you don't just defeat the problem, you build a foundation that nothing can shake. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.